me give a very brief introduction. So Gaël Varoquaux is the research director at the National Institute for Research in Digital Science and Technology, and a co-contributor to scientific computing in Python, scikit-learn, nylearn, and DataCat, amongst others. And his research focuses on the use of machine learning in the public and mental health sector, and the potential in understanding cognition and brain activity. Okay, yeah, if you are ready, then you can start, Gaël.
Thank you very much, Nadine. So I take a different point of view, and my talk may be a bit different from the others. Really, what I'm interested in is how do we establish empirical evidence? How do we, go from observations, data to scientific findings? And the goal of this talk is to be slightly provocative and hopefully make people think about how we're using models to do something. And before I start, I want to stress that I've done a few different things in science. I actually started as a physicist. I worked on quantum physics. My PhD advisor just got the Nobel Prize a few weeks ago. I worked for quite a while after on using brain imaging for cognition, and really trying to work on the statistical inference that goes behind this, using tools such as machine learning. And I really try to collaborate as much as possible with cognitive neuroscience or psychology. These days, I've shifted a bit towards public health, and the questions I'm interested in is how can we inform policy, including in mental health. So this was a really interesting experience, a scientific experience for me, because I've started working on sciences where there are absolute quantities, sciences that are very well quantitative. And these days, I'm really more and more working on sciences where the subject matter is very qualitative. But there's a common trend in all this, is how does scientific knowledge or just knowledge actually emerge from data? And can we somewhat, control this process, maybe statistically? And one question I'd like to ask today is, what role do models play in this? And so I'll first start about evidence in cognitive neuroscience, and I'll describe a bit some view I developed about how empirical evidence is used in cognitive neuroscience, and then I'll do a small section on wider epistemology, claiming that models are overrated in the progress of science. I told you this would be slightly controversial. So let's talk about cognitive neuroscience, and really the classic way evidence is gathered in cognitive neuroscience, especially in brain imaging, where I work most, is that we probe mental processes via positions. So we carefully craft an experimental condition that recruits the mental process, and then we do an elementary psychological manipulation with another experimental condition that's close by, and where we understand basically the difference between those two conditions. And then we reason on the contrast between the two. And this contrast between the two could be statistics on brain images. It could be statistics, so typically imaging neural activity. But before this, it was pioneered via reasoning on differences in reaction times. So really, the framework I'm showing is a fairly general framework. Why do we do this? Because we're trying to isolate mental processes, and mental processes are ongoing in individuals' cognition all the time, and it's hard to isolate them. So behind this, there always is an assumed underlying cognitive model. The manipulations that we design, the way we interpret those manipulations are based on some form of cognitive model, which I'm not defining precisely right now. And it's the idea of the experimental paradigm. The reason we say we have an experimental paradigm is that the experiment is tied to a view of brain function. So the tasks and the stimuli that we use should recruit the right mental processes. That is an assumption by itself. The opposition that we use should cancel out what we're not interested in, which we conveniently call nuances. This is basically assuming most of the inferences we do in cognitive neurosciences when we confront empirical data. So the visual system, for instance, is a paradigmatic example where successive experiments throughout time have revealed specialized regions. So long time ago, Hubel and Wiesel did very specific manipulations that isolated functions of the primary visual cortex, telling us that basically it responded well, it detected well edges, and then people worked out their way, higher and higher up the chain of transformations, showing that areas would be tuned to more abstract forms, even showing that some areas were tuned to faces. And each of those experiments are actually based on a specific opposition that is actually based on an underlying theory that decomposes the mental process here being scene understanding, visual scene understanding. And so, one question we could ask is there a car area? And we could run the experiment and we would get statistical results, and we would conclude that, well, some regions respond to cars. And now the problem is that we can run this way of running experiments with completely invalid ingredients. And with a very high likelihood, we would find brain differences. The reason why we would find brain differences is because experiments are imperfect, but it's an imperfection of the design. It's not an imperfection of the statistics. So we could do basically modern phrenology, and we could use this framework to try to validate phrenology. So that's the first problem. A second problem is that the kind of questions we would like to ask is, what mental processes are supported by given brain structures? The problem is that the empirical manipulation that we do actually implies the observed response. So we can do different experimental manipulations and see pretty much the same brain response, or one that is not easy to distinguish statistically. And so people have been claiming that a given brain structure is related to salience, executive control, pain, but the empirical evidence does not directly give this. It gives us the probability of the neural activity given the mental process. What we would really like is to conclude that a given neural activity implies a given mental process. Now that's hard for multiple reasons. It's hard first because it would be a high-dimensional statistical problem. We have many brain regions, we have many neurons. How do we go from this to some entity, some brain structure on which we can specifically give an association? Another difficulty is that it requires analyzing data on many mental processes, maybe all mental processes, and that ends up being practically very difficult. And ideally, what we would really like is a causal claim and not just those correlations. Okay, so one thing that some people, including us, have been doing over the last decade is to shift a bit the way we do the inferences and start predicting the task from the brain activity using machine learning. Now, the first benefit it gives is a fairly trivial one, is that machine learning is a form of high-dimensional statistics. It resolves the problem of the dimensionality, the fact that we have many neurons, but to do this, it must abandon the well-posed maximum likelihood framework of statistics. So our general inference or general conclusions that we would like to come up with requires data on many, maybe all mental processes. And so to carry forward this research agenda, you basically need to aggregate a lot of data together and basically generalize across many different tasks. And here there's a problem that is that you need basically some form of calibrated labeling of mental processes in all the tasks. And you need to basically describe the tasks beyond oppositions. And that's very hard, even with specialists. And I said we wanted causal claims, and I'll come back to this, but machine learning is also helping us here. Okay, so machine learning is helping us solving the problem that we call the problem of reverse inference. It's also helping us because we can use very complex models that come from artificial intelligence to do a task decomposition that is less reductionist. So let's consider human vision. For human vision, we can use computer vision models as a model for human vision. And then the idea is that the computer vision model is a powerful model of the image. It's a powerful model of the stimuli. So ideally, it has captured all, or at least most aspects of the natural stimuli that are important for visual scene understanding. And then we can use its internal representations to describe the stimuli and to map them to brain responses. So when we're doing this, we're not decomposing the stimuli to a very abstract and overly simple representation. So that's nice because it avoids choosing a few ingredients of a cognitive process to study it. And then it can generalize across different experimental paradigms. So we're no longer locked in an experimental paradigm, we can generalize. So the current state of evidence in cognitive neuroscience is mostly with a focus on significance rather than signal fit. And the problem with this is it leaves the door open to the wrong models, such as phrenology. So I think we need to move forwards towards considering signal fit. And currently, most people use well-posed statistical model, but they must be overly simple to be well-posed. And so they don't answer the question of interest. And part of the modeling is actually transforming the question of interest into this model. And that's where the validity, the control on the inference gets lost. So the benefit of moving towards machine learning or AI to actually do the inference is that it enables to model the actual situations with their whole complexity. Now, most people are not very satisfied with this because they want some form of understanding. And I claim, yes, this is true, but the answer cannot lie in simplistic mechanistic model, which cannot be confronted to data, which unfortunately is too often the case. So that leads me to my second point, which is to claim that models are overrated in science. So the dominant framework for statistical reasoning is to formulate a probabilistic model for mechanical hypotheses, and then fit this model in data and reason from model parameters. The problem is that this completely breaks down when we have the wrong modeling ingredient. And so I claim that we need to reason from model outputs, and I'll show you why. So let's first look a bit about the history of science. The typical view that we inherit on physics, math, chemistry is that these science work by building models from the right ingredients, from what we call the first principles. Our models are built from first principles. But as I'll show you, if we look in the past, this is actually not how the science progressed. They actually progressed by defining the relevant constructs from wrong models. And let's take the example of mechanics. If we go back to early scientists in Greece, they were thinking in terms of the natural motions of objects. There was no notion of force or acceleration, which are the basic principles of mechanics these days. And the way this moved forward was by observation of planetary motion, for instance, by Kepler. And Kepler was just searching for regularities in planets. He was searching for what he called harmonies. And he ended up with laws that are very phenomenological, relating the period square to the cube of the major diameter of the orbit. So, I mean, these are not based on mechanism. And later Newton introduced the modern laws of dynamics. And he was able to do this only because he also introduced differential calculus. And so he was able to have the notion of acceleration which was necessary. You could not build the laws of mechanics without acceleration. And the reason why he convinced people that those laws were good ones is that he could unite observations of celestial and earthly motion. So he could unite what he would see on Earth with what he would see in the sky. So what does this teach us? Well, the early scientists were lacking the key ingredients. The science progressed by models that were in no way mechanistic. And the validity of the model that stuck was established by its ability to generalize across situations and not by its ingredients. Okay, so we can say that, this is no longer relevant. Modern physics knows its law, it doesn't need this. Well, if we look at the 19th century, people were observing that there were anomalies in the orbit of Mercury that were not explained by Newtonian physics. And so they invented an additional planet, Vulcan, and observed it to explain those anomalies. Now, Vulcan does not exist. These were incorrect observations, but they were needed because those anomalies were actually due to general relativity corrections. So this is the idea of what people call in philosophy of science theory-laden observations, is that if you have too strong theory, you'll basically use that theory as a framework to interpret your observation. And fast forward to today, people are using machine learning, so basically purely statistical model, even in things such as particle physics, where particle physics is the most precise, the most exact science, natural science that we have. And the reason they're doing this is that, so the particle physics is very precise, but there are lots of uncontrolled noise in the experiments. And so to model the noise, they're using pure statistical models. So my claim really is that phenomenological data fits have been crucial to science. Basically, science uses false models as a mean for truer theory, and I stole this sentence from the philosopher William Wimsatt. And when we have a bias towards some simplistic mechanistic models, so very pure, simple mathematical theories, but that bias is not adapted to the messy world beyond pure physics, and actually beyond physics in very pure conditions. The bridges are not built via very simple mathematical theories. And finally, I claim that generalizations or prediction failures in general are what make or break scientific theories. So I'll fast forward a bit, but I want to talk a bit about what makes validity and reasoning of scientific models. And the first thing I want to stress, and I'll somewhat, fast forward through this, is that validity is much more than statistical validity. Validity is the idea of being able to generalize. Validity is the idea that your reasoning and your experiments are built on ingredients that we're going to call constructs that you understand and that you can measure well. One example is intelligence. This is difficult to measure well. It may or may not be a valid construct. And finally, the way in cognitive neuroscience we tend to reason a lot is by wanting that the entities that we do not observe have a strong validity. It's called realism in the philosophy of science. But is this a good way to build a science? I don't know. We can debate about the validity of intelligence, but in physics, we never debate about whether a center of gravity exists or not. That's not a question. It's just something that is useful to observe, to explain the observations. So the way we reason in statistics and in science in general is often by reasoning via the parameters of our models. So basically, we craft a probabilistic model of the data, and then we reason on this model. But we can also reason on the output of the model. And I claim we need more of that. I'm running out of time, so I'll just go quickly. one reason why we need to reason on the outputs of the model rather than the modeling ingredients is that even experts cannot choose the right models. And I'm claiming this empirically. There has been a set of experiments, one in cognitive brain imaging, where people have asked many different experts to analyze the same data, and not in an adversarial way, helping them. And then they've confronted the conclusions. And the problem is that there's so much variability in the way the models are built that the conclusions are all different. So if we reason on the output of the model rather than the ingredient of the model, we can compare the output of the model to the observed data, and then we can conclude on whether the model is reliable or not. And finally, the only strong evidence about whether a model is correct or not is whether it generalizes, whether it generalizes to new data, whether it explains observations. And if we want to focus on the internals of our models, we're going to focus on cleaner and cleaner experiments. We're going to focus on experiments that have no variability. That's called focusing on internal validity. And that actually reduces the external validity of our models. So I claim that we can still do causal reasoning. And the reason is that the notion of causality is the notion of intervention. We have observational data. We don't have controlled observations, controlled interventions. So for instance, people who are sick tend to go more to the hospital. So we cannot conclude on the causal effect of going to the hospital. But we can build a model that relates the health context of the individual before going to the hospital and the outcome. And we can fit this model, learn this model on individuals that went to the hospitals and did not go to the hospital. And this will be a purely machine learning model. It won't be a mechanistic model. But based on this, then we can infer the causal effect of going to the hospital. And that is related to a field that is developing a lot today, which is causal inference with machine learning. So I'll stop there. I'll just say that machine learning or AI, so powerful data fit, gives methods that allow us to do inferences with imperfect theory. And I believe that these methods are extremely important in the fields of cognitive science and biology, because I do not believe that simple models will actually explain the real world. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaël. Thanks a lot for your talk. Let me have a look at the Q&A. There is one question, or a few questions actually. So one from Galen Wilkerson, if I pronounce this correctly. The question is, if we only reason empirically on the outputs and generalization of the model, but don't know what's going on inside the model, have we really gained any understanding, or haven't we exported understanding to our collection of black boxes? This poses a very modern question. It's almost sci-fi. Perhaps AI methods will have their own journals that we cannot understand. So
it's a question I often get, and the question is, what does understanding mean? And I believe understanding means, so it's an ill-defined concept, but understanding means reasoning on the situation in our brain. And in a sense, it's not a very satisfactory situation indeed to have a big black box that is able to tell us, the future looks like this. It's just like the weather forecast. We don't understand the simulation itself of the weather forecast. However, we can decompose it and understand some ingredients, which we can then use as, say, a sailor to reason on what's going to happen in the near future. So I believe, science will progress in two ways. It will progress in a quantitative way with models that are too complex to understand, and quantum physics is deemed as too complex to understand in general relativity too. And then we'll have simplified narratives. But the point being that those simplified narratives are not more valid than the complex model. They're actually less valid.
Okay, thanks. Another question that's more of an, it relates to something you've been talking about at the beginning, to maximum likelihood framework. So the question is, would Gaël mind expanding on the issue of abandoning a well-posed maximum likelihood framework that he introduced early on in his presentation, for those of us who might not be experts in machine learning?
So the well-posed maximum likelihood framework would be the standard statistical view. The standard statistical view basically describes the observed data with probability distributions and then fits them by saying, I'm going to find the data that maximizes the likelihood, so the probability of observed data. I'm going to find a model parameter that maximizes the likelihood, so the probability of observed data. And this is the dominant framework of statistics, is that it has served us very well. But when you start having models that are too complex, you don't have enough data to do this. The model is ill-posed in the sense that there are many different model parameters that can explain almost as well the same data. And that's a fundamental problem of statistics, and it's related to high-dimensional statistics. And machine learning, which I don't see as in opposition to statistics, by the way, I really see it as part of statistics, has basically abandoned this and said, I don't care about this. I don't care about this. I will no longer have strong guarantees. I will not be able to conclude on some aspects of my model parameters. However, I will be able to explain well the outcomes.
Okay, thanks. One more question from Vince. The structure of a CNN, only feed-forward, is quite different from the architecture of biological visual processing. How can machine learning promise to reach a whole space of solutions?
That's a good question. So basically, the models that we use for if we're trying to confront brain signals to models of the corresponding task, the model of the corresponding task is probably not doing the same thing in the brain. It might or might not, because it's subject to the same constraints. So, but also it's probably imperfect. And CNNs, for instance, the standard, like the good old vision CNN, do not really have a way of propagating attention back, which the brain has. And so my claim is not, that, we have a CNN and we've sold the brain. That certainly is not my claim. My claim is that we need to use rich models of the stimuli and then to confront their internals to the brain. And we do need to reinvent how we do things. But the game is still going to go on. We're going to use not only richer models, but also richer data, because you need to be able to reveal specific phenomena. And CNNs are not the end of the story, of course.
Okay, yeah, great. So I guess now, we can transition to a break. Thanks a lot for your talk, Gaël.